If you've ever had your leave restricted by the federal government before March of 2020, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. What is up? It is Nathaniel Shimkovitz, devout patriot and author, here today to kind of give you a little bit of introspection, maybe something a little bit to munch on, maybe if you're thinking about writing a book or getting into some other kind of storytelling during these crazy COVID-19 times that we live in right now. This is just something to put out there, maybe food for thought for you. So this is a video I'm planning on doing like once every other week. So if you like this style of content, go ahead, hit that like button, go ahead, share it with your friends, hit that bell icon so you can stay up with all of the uploads I'm going to be doing, including the Shroud of Peace audio adaptation that I got coming out April 14th. It's going to be huge. I highly recommend you check it out and share it with all your friends. So I'm not going to talk about that. Today, I'm going to be talking about a question that I feel like has irked me quite a bit, and maybe even has irked you quite a bit. Whenever you go walk into a bookstore, or if you've woken up in the 1990s, all of a sudden, Blockbuster, and heard somebody say, fantasy and science fiction are exactly the same, and go, what? This is kind of that beef I've had. I've gotten in this fight many a times with many a different people who say that fantasy and science fiction are essentially the same thing. This isn't a video about which is better, which I think is better, which I'll tell you that at the end of the video, or you'll probably be able to figure out which I think is better. So basically, the question is, are fantasy and science fiction the same genre? The answer to that question is passive aggressive. So to get into it, I'm going to just break down a little bit kind of history of these two genres and also why they're different. Why they're different, why they're similar. So, okay, to get started, fantasy and science fiction both draw from the same literary traditions. I'm not going to get into how there were automata in Arthurian legend, and how there's time travel and flying machines, all this crazy stuff, and ancient mythologies, and how magic has been a staple of fiction ever since the dawn of this stuff. No, I'm not going to get into that because I can trace that back to any kind of fiction. Specifically, what we understand as fantasy and science fiction today stem from speculative fiction, which is a tradition that was begun in the 18th century, or not 18th, 19th century, I'm sorry, by a collection of authors, most famous of which Mary Shelley and her novel Frankenstein. So I'm not going to go overboard with the history or analysis. If you want literature history lecture, go take a course at your local community college. So basically, these both fantasy and science fiction stem from speculative fiction, and this style of fiction writing very simply begins with a very open-ended question or statement depending on what floats your boat. What if, or suppose blank. This has gone on to inspire classic works of science fiction, War of the Worlds, 20,000 Leagues, blah, blah, blah. Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit of J.R.R. Tolkien, basically reinventing fantasy as a whole. And then later Star Wars, which has basically brought us into this whole thing. Star Wars is not a science fiction story, and I'll make a video on that later, but I'm not here to talk about that today. So pretty much the reason today why a lot of science fiction and fantasy are conflated as one is mainly Star Wars' fault. Star Wars took the tropes of science fiction, the tropes of fantasy, the tropes of Western, threw them all in a blender, and basically poured out this really simplified story to the masses. It was a huge success. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think it's actually made some really interesting changes in pop culture, some positive, some negative. But basically, it made this really simple story to where Star Wars and Lord of the Rings are compared and contrasted quite frequently because they're both these larger-than-life adventures, and have this quite simple story at the meat of it. So fantasy and science fiction are often conflated together. They're also conflated together because if you've ever been to a bookstore in the last 20 years, or you went on Amazon in the last 10 years, you'll notice that a lot of them put science fiction and fantasy in the same category, in the same section, category, whatever you're on, website, whatever. But basically, they'll put them together, and you can refine your search in an online engine, and in bookstores, they're segregated a little bit. But generally speaking, the science fiction and fantasy are put together in the same section. So, so they have a lot in common. They both stem from the same tradition. So, what's different about it? So, the way that I see it, there are three things that really make science fiction and fantasy different. And that's the basic building blocks of these stories with speculative fiction traditions, characters, and themes, or rather the approach to themes. So starting with that first one, the building blocks. Again, going back to speculative fiction, we all begin with that question, what if? In the case of writing a fantasy story or building a fantasy story, that what if question begins incredibly broad. It can be as simple as, what if vampires existed? What if magic existed? Yada, 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 stuff like that. You begin with an incredibly broad question with no limitations kind of things. And it's really dangerous to do this in general. If you've ever asked a writer or an artist, what if, they immediately go, holy crap, I can do whatever I want. But by comparison, then that's also the scariest thing to ask us, because then it's, holy crap, I can do whatever I want. Yeah. So basically, with fantasy, you start with this really broad what if question. And as you develop your story, as you write it out or do whatever, it slowly becomes more and more and more specific until you have a functioning world and characters. So by contrast, writing a science fiction story, you write what if. It can also be a very broad question, but that what if question has a very specific set of connotations. Like, for example, what if AI were sentient? You have a set of limitations right off the bat, right there. And some, what is that? What are those limitations? It's in the name of the genre, science fiction. Anything in a science fiction story must be at least scientifically feasible on some level. Or if introduced to some out-of-this-world, zany thing that basically turns everything on its head, the story and characters are trying to figure out this out-of-this-world anomaly through our understanding of science, through our understanding of the world. And there are some cases where they can explain it, or they can't. So it's not always set in stone what is going on, but it can be cracked by our understanding of science. By contrast, fantasy relies entirely on the internal logic of the story alone. Any rules of the magic system or whatever it is you're setting up in fantasy operate solely on the internal logic of that story, and if something is introduced that breaks those rules, you have to bend over backward to try and explain that in your own story. Whereas science fiction, something happens that basically breaks the laws of physics. It is supposed to be a general what the F moment. It's supposed to be this really confusing sort of thing that the characters struggle to figure out. So, okay. Moving on to characters in this case. The progression, fantasy characters are interesting. They're supposed to be inherently relatable, but they also are generally very simple. I'm not saying you can't have complex characters in a fantasy setting, but usually fantasy characters are a bit simpler. They have a very simple character progression most of the time. Most of the time, and generally focus around the hero's journey. The point of a lot of fantasy stories is to empower characters, and I'll explain why in the next segment I do, but it's generally kind of much simpler characters, and they're always inostensibly human. Science fiction, on the other hand, characters usually are much more complex, or at least have to deal with much more complex conflicts, and usually characters in science fiction are usually a little bit more complex. They're human. It's a difficult thing to really convey, convey, and I have to use the next section to do this, but science fiction characters, lead science fiction characters, most of the time, overwhelming majority of the time, are human beings. And it goes into the thematics of it, so I guess I'll break into that section now. The themes of science fiction usually tend to be a little bit more resonant than the themes in fantasy. And it's because, going back to what I was saying before about how fantasy, you begin with a very broad what-if question. You have to make it more and more specific as the story goes on. With fantasy, if you try to introduce very relevant themes, or you introduce an allegory into your story, it often becomes very ham-fisted just because of the logic of the world, to where suddenly introducing a current issue in a fantasy story doesn't make sense because the world around you shouldn't exist like that. See examples like Bright or Carnival Row, how they try and wrap their entire story around a very contemporary issue, and it's kind of lopsided and very purpose domination by the author to ram an agenda through their story. Not saying that's a bad thing, but it can be an inherent limitation of fantasy. Science fiction, you can be quite a bit more creative about how you approach issues, and it's a lot easier to use allegory in science fiction. Basically, if you want an example, go watch just about any episode of Star Trek. Yes, there are some idiotically simple little allegories in there, but science fiction depends on our understanding of science, and the biggest aspect of that is probably the scientific method. You watch any episode of Star Trek, an issue is picked apart and analyzed from every different perspective, try something, usually fails, the situation gets worse, and then the crew of the Enterprise has to try something else to try and overcome that problem, and it's resolved usually through techno jargon, space magic, whatever. But basically, in that case, science fiction, you have a much broader range of themes you can deal with. It's a lot easier to deal with themes because it's set in our world with human characters. So I know I've probably pissed off a lot of people with this, and you have people out there saying that, but you didn't answer the question of why science fiction and fantasy are so similar because of this. Okay. Science fiction and fantasy only come off as similar because people only see the two major genres: the space opera and high fantasy. High fantasy is Lord of the Rings level stuff. Space opera is your Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, Babylon 5, that kind of stuff. So this argument often revolves around those two genres, or two subgenres of fantasy and science fiction. The reality is, fantasy, you have a number of different subgenres. You've got paranormal fiction, you've got paranormal fiction, you've got urban fantasy, you've got a number of different things you can deal with in that. Science fiction, you also have a number of subgenres. You got cyberpunk, alternate history, falls under the purview of science fiction. They're just so broad, there's no specific time period that you're limited to with either of these genres, and where you can be very creative with them. But going back to the rules I cited earlier, or the general sort of differences I cited earlier, there are different approaches to doing each genre. But probably the most pinnacle of which, and this is more catered toward science fiction, is that the way I would, if I had to use one word to describe each of them, fantasy is more romantic, it's more empowering, it's more about finding the good in people with fantasy. Science fiction is a little bit more cold, it's callous, it's almost borderline nihilistic sometimes. It's not saying all science fiction is really dark. It's saying that science fiction generally has a more analytical subject matter and something that challenges you a little bit more than fantasy usually would. So I know that that's my opinion, and you are free to have your opinion too. Like, if you have a conflicting opinion, go ahead, express that in the comments. If I got something wrong, feel free to express your discontent in the comments. Like, if there's an example I'm missing of a good allegory in fantasy, go ahead, drop that in the comments. I'd be more than happy to go check it out. But that's really all I've got for you. Just have a good night, stay safe, stay sane. I hope to see you again in the next video. Have a good night.